Oh boy, guys. Are you buckled in for this? I hope so, because it is time to talk about Richard Nixon. Richard Milhouse Nixon, one of the craziest presidencies ever in America till recently. And one of the people I think that clearly, based on all the stuff that I've read, people just don't know what to think about him. Was he crazy? Was he smart but misled? Was he paranoid? Was he what caused Watergate? How did we get here? How? And I have to say, after reading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 books on the Nixon era, I'm still not sure I know the answer, because nonfiction is all narrative, and depending on the mindset of the person who writes the book, they want you to think a certain way because they've come to a certain conclusion, and that will certainly come up in some of the books that I talk about today. So here we go. A lot of these books, of these 9 books, are thanks to Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. And Bob Woodward has been in the news a lot lately, but if you don't know, their book, All the President's Men, which is the first one that I'll talk about, was one of the definitive accounts from the era of Watergate, about Watergate, because Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were the Washington Post reporters who are often credited with keeping the Watergate scandal in the news when it was maybe about to disappear, cracking some of the big stories, and eventually they won quite a few awards for their investigative journalism around this time. So after the whole thing was over, they were approached by a publisher who said, please, will you put this in a book? Will you write a book about how you came to process the story? It's also a very famous movie, which I have seen. It's quite good, with Robert Redford. And so they're a big deal, and they parlayed their success of All the President's Men into quite a few books, which we'll talk about. The key thing about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein's writing style throughout this era of their books, or eventually Bob Woodward just keeps writing them, Carl Bernstein skips out, is that it's very clear that they are journalists first. There's not a lot of extraneous narrative, a lot of extraneous description. It is a description of events, their best recollection or their best shot through their sources of how these events came to happen, how they happened, what was said, who was there, etc. So it's not like, it doesn't read like a fiction book, for example. It's a very, very minimal storytelling, which I quite like, because you push through quite a bit of information quite quickly, and you know that they've backed up all of this from, anywhere from 3 to 5 sources have guaranteed. And then where they say we weren't able to get another person to corroborate this, they will say that in the book, which doesn't always happen. I know that I was astounded when, for example, I read Alexis Coe's biography of George Washington, and she picked apart some stuff that Ron Chernow said that happened that they only had one source for, but he turned it into this whole thing. So it's refreshing to read these books where they're very, very open about their sources, how they got to these conclusions, and how certain or uncertain they are about this piece of information. So All the President's Men was considered one of the definitive books describing how Watergate happens, right? And if you read one of these books, this is one of the classics to read. One of the really interesting things about Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, when they work together, Bob Woodward is a Republican, Carl Bernstein is a Democrat, and I think it comes out, this is a very even-keeled attempt at a representation of what happened. But All the President's Men is not the whole story. Again, this pared down writing style just kind of brings you from when they started to investigate Watergate, what they happened to find, and how they brought this all to light. So it's the reporter's view of how Watergate progresses forward. To get different views of how Watergate was presented happened behind the scenes, you read some of their other books. So for example, there's The Final Days, both by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, and this unpacks more of the flip side. What was happening behind the scenes in the final days of the Nixon White House? So instead of focusing on Carl and Bob's attempt to uncover Watergate, this flips the script and says, you know, while Carl and Bob's thing was happening in the background, here's what was happening in the White House during that a similar period in time as they tried to prevent Watergate from ending the Nixon presidency. So those two books are really, really interesting. They kind of create each side of a coin view of what happened, although it's not, you know, the completely same time period or the same events that they cover. But I loved reading those in conjunction with each other. It was really cool. Bob and Carl also wrote a book called The Secret Man, The Story of Watergate's Deep Throat. Deep Throat is a very important character to the Watergate story. During All the President's Men, he is referred to as Deep Throat. He is up in the upper echelons of the FBI, and he feeds Carl and Bob this serious insider information that helps to bring them to a place where they can crack the Watergate scandal wide open. And for the longest time, nobody knew who Deep Throat was. Carl and Bob kept it completely under wraps. They did not want this person's name out there. But when he became elderly, the man who was Deep Throat, his actual name is Mark Felt, came out and said, I was Deep Throat, this is why I did it. And so Carl and Bob wrote a book about Mark Felt and what led him to become this informant, why he did it, his career, what he was seeing behind the scenes in the FBI, and his own personal journey. Because Mark Felt really, really did believe in, you know, the United States of America. You know, do you betray the president or the presidency, president or country? It's a very interesting profile on this particular person who is one of the most important cogs in this story. Bob Woodward by himself also wrote a book called The Last of the President's Men, and this focuses on one man named Alexander Butterfield, who is the person who in the committee assigned to investigate Watergate reveals that Nixon had a taping system. And of course this just, you know, brings you to the smoking gun tape is the reason Nixon eventually asked to resign. Like the taping system ended everything. And when you read many of these books, when you watch many documentaries, by the time I read The Last of the President's Men, I had read most of these books. I had watched a lot of documentaries. So the time I got here, I was like, oh yeah, I know that name. Why does he have a whole book on him? And it ends up being that, you know, Alexander Butterfield was one of the last people who really, you know, was standing by the president's side, trying to not let it slip. He was one of the only people, one of, I think, maybe 4 people who really knew that the taping system existed. So he was one of the few people who could have blown the Watergate Commission wide open. So it's interesting. I would call it more supplementary reading than anything else. I would definitely read All the President's Men and The Final Days out of all 4 of these, but it was really interesting. And again, it was someone who, in my mind, played a very small part, well, a huge part, but a small moment where he reveals the taping system. But obviously there is a journey, like he was one of the only people that knew that it existed. Obviously he was very high up in Nixon's White House. So it's very, very interesting to read how he comes to terms with revealing the tapes to the Watergate Committee. So those are the 4 books by Woodward and Bernstein, or just Woodward if you count Last of the President's Men. So then we start to get into some actual biographies. For my actual Nixon biography, I read Nixon, A Life by John Farrell. I will talk about that one a little bit more in my actual episode that covers Nixon for this challenge. In terms of a biography that actually holistically covers Nixon's life, you want Nixon alive. In terms of supplemental material, I read Being Nixon, A Man Divided by Evan Thomas. And Evan Thomas comes right out and says in the beginning, this is not a comprehensive biography. This is a psychological study of Nixon the man. How does Watergate happen? How does this man okay so much of this stuff? How did we get here? And that is Evan Thomas's project. So, not that it doesn't include a lot of biography, it feels very much like a biography, but it is focused less on his presidency, its political gains, and more on how Nixon's brain got through his life. And so if that's something that you're interested in, and I definitely was, it is a very, very interesting biography to read. The thing with Evan Thomas's biography, psychological study, is that I do feel at the end of the day, you come out thinking, obviously Nixon made bad decisions, but because Evan Thomas's project is to rationalize everything, to try to figure out how Nixon's brain gets from winning the presidency, Daniel Ellsberg's office, Watergate, like how you go through that. His project is to try to figure out that path. And you come out feeling like that has been rationalized, even if the thoughts are crazy, like the mental loop-de-loops to get there are nuts. You come out thinking like, oh, that's feasible. And again, that's Thomas's project. So to the flip side of that, I also read One Man Against the World, The Tragedy of Richard Nixon by Tim Weiner. And this is a biography that says Nixon did wrong. Tim Weiner's book is not here to rationalize, it's not here to sugarcoat, it's here to plug through the rise and fall of Richard Nixon and the tragedy that his presidency, his political career ultimately becomes at the end of Watergate. And how a man who seemed so smart, so put together, sabotages not only his own life, but really the American presidency. Tim is not here to rationalize, he's not here to play devil's advocate. He's here to say this was damaging to Nixon as a person and damaging to the country in these ways. Again, there are certain things that Nixon does, such as the opening to China, that it's really hard to argue with. He was a very important president. He was, a pretty smart dude. But reading Being Nixon and One Man Against the World next to each other, again, it presents that both sides of a coin thing that I'm fascinated in reading and comparing. And there are plenty of other books on Nixon that I could have chosen and probably will continue to choose and read, but these were the ones that I've gotten through so far. So then we get into a couple of really interesting books on little facets of the Nixon presidency. And so there is a book titled Frost Nixon, Behind the Scenes of the Nixon Interviews by David Frost. And again, this has also been made into a very popular movie, Frost Nixon. These were a series of debates that happened long after Nixon had left the presidency with a British TV host named David Frost, who writes this book. And everyone thought that it was going to be quite a bit of fluff, and it ended up being a very, very interesting interview where Nixon basically said things like, it's not illegal if the president does it, paraphrasing, and was the closest anyone ever got to him apologizing for Watergate. Nixon maintained for the most part that he did not owe America an apology. Whatever your view on that is, that was his thing, but Frost thought that if he could get Nixon to apologize, that would be like the redemptive moment and great TV it was pretty good TV. So this book was written after the Frost and Nixon interviews were made into a very popular stage play, and then they were made into a movie, which I also have watched. It's quite good. And then David Frost wrote the book. The thing about the book is that David Frost is slightly more interested in David Frost taking on Nixon than Nixon. And he's just more interested in himself and putting the interviews into a good light, which is fine. That's his life. He can do the thing. But watch the movie, watch the interviews. It's better that way. Speaking of things that are maybe not worth your time, I also read The Fall of Richard Nixon, A Reporter Remembers Watergate by Tom Brokaw. Thought this would be super interesting because Tom Brokaw is obviously a well-respected TV anchor who was there through Watergate, did a lot of the Watergate reporting, but it's like a series of vignettes about his life with Watergate in the background. It just wasn't interesting to me. So, I'm not gonna talk about that a lot. It's fine. Finally, tangentially related to Nixon, I also listened to Kissinger by Walter Isaacson because one of the craziest people in the background of Watergate is Henry Kissinger, who had a huge impact on our foreign policy. There's debates on whether foreign policy came from him or Nixon. He had an ego like the same size as Nixon's. He was quite paranoid, quite all over the place, and his life proves it. So Walter Isaacson is an amazing biographer. Nixon and Kissinger's relationship, I know, has several books on it that I also like to read, but I wanted to read a biography on Kissinger, and this was really excellent one to do. Kissinger gave a lot of interviews to Isaacson, so I think it comes out kind of pro-Kissinger for that reason, but it was a great view of the life of someone who was very integral to not just the Nixon presidency, because he appears in our foreign policy before that and after that. So also a great book. So we finally made it to the end. Woo! If you have other book suggestions for me, please do let me know down in the comments. Let's see how long it takes me to go back down the Nixon rabbit hole. I hope quite a while. So thanks for hanging out for this rather long video, and I will see you guys soon. Bye!